It's very loud, sorry. We're gonna get started, everyone.
It counted down.
Okay. Welcome to the Subawards Subcommittee. We are your co-chairs. Should we?
Yeah, let's go in line order.
Ourselves. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Amanda Haymaker from Purdue University.
I'm Amanda Humphrey from Northeastern University.
I'm Stephanie Scott from Columbia University, and you're a rowdy bunch.
A very rowdy bunch today.
They're still bringing in their snacks. It's everyone's hyper. It's the end of the day. All right, let's go for it.
So today's agenda, we're going to do an update on some topics that we talked about at the last meeting, namely research integrity and certificate of confidentiality. We're going to give a little update on subaward templates. We're going to talk a little bit about fixed price and clinical trials, guidance document updates, and a new proposed form that was sent out on the listserv just prior to the meeting, and also talk a little bit about foreign guidance. And then I know we have a few questions that we've heard floating around at this meeting, so we'll have time for those as well. So to get started, just to refresh everyone on what we discussed last time around research integrity. Basically, we got a question about why there is not currently research integrity language in the FDP subaward template. So we did a little bit of research on research integrity in the federal context, and most of the policies that are out there stem from this Office of Science and Technology policy, general policy, which lays out the general requirements for conducting research without falsifying or fabricating data, also known as research misconduct. This applies to research funded by all federal agencies, and then each agency has its own implementation. So the level of specificity will vary from agency to agency, with HHS and NSF having pretty detailed policies out there and procedures for managing those. So after we talked to folks at the last meeting, we actually went back to the person who initially had asked us the question, and it was a research integrity officer, and we got a little bit more information. So the reason that they had asked the question in the first place was they had a RIO meeting, and a member of the OIG was there. And during that discussion, the OIG wanted to know what institutions were doing to ensure subrecipients have applicable policies or assurances in place. And so I think there was a lot of, okay, well, let's take a look at this and see what our institutions are doing. How are we reflecting this in our templates, etc. So one of the interesting things about this conversation was also that the RIO indicated most of our institutions as FDP members probably have some sort of research integrity assurance on file with the government, where we confirm that we have an appropriate policy in place for managing research misconduct proceedings. And basically that assurance is kind of like your OLAW or your federal-wide assurance numbers, and it's pretty easy, pretty routine, a little bit behind the scenes. So because she said that, we thought about a couple of different options to help to manage this without necessarily going straight to, let's add something to the FDP subaward template. So one thing that we did talk about, and we've discussed it provisionally a little bit with Lynette, and we're happy to talk a little bit with the FDP clearinghouse folks in greater detail, is having that assurance information somehow in the profiles on the expanded clearinghouse. Felt like that would be, you certify that you have the assurance there, that it's current, it's what we do for our IRB and IACUC information. So that would be treating things consistently across the board, and then maybe adding something more explicit to the foreign template, or creating some sort of guidance for those entities that may not be foreign, but maybe are smaller institutions or institutions that are just kind of breaking into the research space and might not have a policy. So we went back and looked at the data. And we had asked the question of, should we add language to the templates and or create guidance? We received 71 total responses, of which 6 institutions had no preference. 42 institutions said they did not want language added to the template, some of which did say that guidance would be sufficient in their mind. 8 institutions were not sure, and 15 institutions said yes, they thought that we should add some language to the template. So based on that and based on our conversation with the RIO, these are our suggested outcomes. That we look at adding some language to the foreign template for 2019. We also wanted to bring up the idea of some sort of a welcome packet for foreign institutions, perhaps pulling in some other post-award management and monitoring things around billing, financial information, etc. Just some things that may be different country to country, that we may want to have some general information available that's consistent for our foreign collaborators. Then exploring the FTP expanded clearinghouse. And then as for the standard FTP subaward template, we would not add any language, and then we would create some guidance explaining a little bit of the context around this and helping people to remember why we made some of these business decisions. So really what we're asking you to vote on right now, just a little straw poll in the room, is does this seem like a reasonable plan? So if this seems like a good, reasonable plan, please raise your hands. Oh, I love that. That's great. Okay. Fantastic. So then this is the plan that we're going to try and pursue. We'll probably have an update for you in September. As part of that, though, we do want to let you know we're going to be trying to find ways to outreach and engage with the RIO community so that they feel like they're part of this process. We did get some feedback from some RIOs that were a little confused by what the conversation around this was and what prompted it, and didn't necessarily have all the right information. So we do want to make sure that we loop back to them and make sure that they feel that they have that. So we're going to find some ways to do that, just so you all know.
The Midwest Rios are a rowdy bunch. They're very vocal. Okay. Moving on to certificates of confidentiality, which was the other part of the survey that we did. First of all, is there anyone here from NIH in the room? Any? Don't be shy. No? Okay. We could talk freely and frankly. So, that's okay. So, recap of this with certificates of confidentiality. As you recall, what we talked about at the last meeting was NIH changed their business process regarding this. This was a mandate that was coming from the 21st Century Cures Act. So, instead of entities going to NIH requesting a certificate of confidentiality, what was covered under a confidentiality, certificate of confidentiality was much broader, and instead what NIH decided to do was to then incorporate it automatically in the notice of award, which is actually incorporated into the grants policy statement in terms of how we are supposed to adhere to the certificate of confidentiality policy. So within that, we as pass-through entities have a requirement to flow down that language to the subrecipient, and there's a lot of conversation taking place in terms of what exactly does that mean? What is our obligation? What are we ensuring? Are we ensuring that we're communicating it? Are we ensuring that the entity is complying with the policy? I know that several institutions came to us because they were having these conversations with their general counsels and with their IRBs. You know, what are we doing? What is the FTP doing? So as a result of the survey, unlike the integrity question, which was very clear that we're not going to add language or add burden to our templates, this was completely all over the map. So with the 71 institutions that responded, 13 were not sure what they were going to do at the close of the survey. 6 said, no, don't include any language. In other words, we feel that just flowing down what's in the grants policy statement is good enough for the subrecipient. 10 institutions will use, and remember, let me recap here. We provided 2 boilerplate languages of sample boilerplate language for you to use, an option 1 and an option 2. Option 1 was a lot more lengthy. Partners Healthcare drafted that language. And then option 2 was the scaled down version, probably half as long. And so, just to remind you of those options. So 15 institutions, 10 said we're going to try out both in the coming year. 15 institutions said we like option 1, the more detailed one. 27 said we like the scaled down one, option 2. But as you can see, people are still confused with this. And even at my own institution, I'm still waiting for my general counsel to talk to our outside general counsel because we have different ideas in interpreting what exactly it is that is being required. And so also within that survey, we did get some great suggestions in the language itself that we were offering. And so now comes the suggested outcomes.
Right. So one thing I just want to point out that was interesting in reviewing the data, that the institution type did not seem to impact the response. In other words, covered entities did not overwhelmingly prefer the more detailed option 1 language. And then there were some institutions that don't really seem to be covered entities based on what I understand their research portfolio to look like, and they really felt strongly about having very detailed language in there. So that was also another thing that we were interested to see in the data and results. So we felt like we couldn't make any really clear suggestions about this is what we should do in the coming year in terms of pursuing one option of language. So what we've decided to do is to present those two pieces of language, the longer and the shorter language, and we're going to actually just post both in a Word document on the FDP website, and we are going to allow members to just play with it for a few months. Put it in some templates, see what pushback you get, see where, let the conversations continue at your institutions because this is a very big change for us. And test out what works best. And as much as you can, if you're able to do some very high level tracking, like we got more pushback on option 1 versus option 2. It doesn't have to be detailed down to we issued 55 subawards and 20 of them said that they, that they liked option 2 and 5 of them said they liked option 1. Just a general sense would be absolutely fine, but be thinking about it over the next few months. So then what we're thinking is we will ask you for feedback at some point around January after the next January or so, after September or January, some point in the fall, maybe fall, early winter,
somewhere around then.
Yeah, we'll give it a few months, but we're going to ask you guys. We'll put out another survey out there. We want to hear about your experiences before we go incorporating this into the templates. And then based on that, we'll figure out where we're going to go. And then we will also continue to work on creating FAQs and guidance that will go along with this.
Right. And so bottom line, continue to communicate with us about the conversations you're having with your own institutions and tell us, informally what you're using and especially how your subrecipients are responding to the language that you're choosing. If you choose to use any at all.
Right.
And so taking the temperature again, the room, does this sound like a reasonable approach or do you have other suggestions? Okay, raise your hands if you think it's a reasonable approach. Okay. Which brings us to this. Okay, this slide right here. I've heard you. So let me tell you what I'm going to say here. So how many of you were on the Subawards listserv this week? On Monday, we sent something out that were 2 draft documents. It was a guidance document and a draft form. Did anyone see that? It's called a content change request form. Okay. Okay, if you don't know what I'm talking about, and for those of you who did see it, did you have a chance to look at it and read it at all? Okay, some of you did. So now let me explain what this is and why I say I've heard you. So for the past couple of years, I know since I've been in this role, I guess I've been in this for about 2 years. These ladies have been in it a little bit longer than I have. Every time I come to the meeting, I'm at the reception, I get my drink, I get my plate of crudités, and most assured, I can be assured that someone will come up to me and say, Stephanie, that was a really great session. I love what you guys are doing. But why do we have to talk about this? This shouldn't even be an issue. And then another person comes up to me. So I put down my drink. So another person comes up to me and says, Stephanie, This is going to impact
Finish my drink.
this is going to impact how I'm auto-populating my templates. Did you take that into consideration? And so I'm having that conversation and I put down my plate. And then another person comes up to me and says, well, how is that going to impact subrecipient monitoring? And then I turn around and the nice people at the Hyatt took my plate and my drink away and I can't find it. And so to avoid this, well, okay. But bottom line is I'm saying I heard you. And what this made me think of, and as the three of us were talking, and we talk very frequently, is how do we vet and control the types of content requests that we get. We get suggestions for adding language to the subaward templates, because what we want to do, obviously our goal is always to reduce administrative burden. And how are we looking at all the key things that are there for consideration before just having huge discussions about it? Or did we really think through it before even taking it to you guys for discussion? And it would have been great, to have this document or this change request form, as we were talking about integrity and certificates of confidentiality. But let me tell you what the purpose of these documents are. So one, it's a draft guidance document and a change request form. The guidance document, I would say, is even more important than the request form, because the guidance document has a listing of considerations of why and when we would consider adding additional language to the templates. And so what the guidance document provides, first of all, is one, and I forgot to say one thing. So as we were talking about coming up with ways to vet through this, I said, you know what, let's go to the guidance document working group and let's see if we could put something really quickly together, a draft of something, just to initially share with membership and see if you like this idea. And so the group and I, and us, we all got together and we had weekly calls and we quickly put this out. And the purpose of the guidance document of this is, one, it provides a communication tool for you when your internal stakeholders, such as your general counsel, your risk assessment office, your controller's office says, I want to change this, or I think we need to add language on that. You've got something to show them, to communicate with them that says, this is the purpose of the FDP. This is the purpose of the templates. We're trying to reduce burden. We're trying to minimize this. Let's think through this first. And so the guidance document provides the background of FTB. It's a communication tool for you. It contains a checklist of considerations prior to making the request. So one, is the change that you're requesting applicable to all members? Is it something that can be handled another way, such as an FAQ or a guidance document? Is it something that you didn't even realize was already flowed down in a grants policy statement? What is the impact on business processes or subrecipient monitoring or invoicing? And so it's this list of considerations to consider, so you could talk internally and then make the formal request to us. And so then we have a draft change request form where the individual then has to provide the rationale that's required. And it also gives us consistency in the way that we collect this information and could share it with membership. So we know right away that the individual has kind of checked already, okay, was this something already flowed down? Oh, wait a minute. It might even stop it dead in the circle because it's like, oh, well, an FAQ would really address it. So this is what we're trying to do, because I think we've really heard you, because you're concerned about adding anything more to the templates. And we don't want to make revisions any more than we have to. And so I want to give a huge shout out to the guidance document working group, and I am going to be calling for some new members and fresh faces and more voices on that, because it's a great opportunity for people to get involved. So here's my quick rundown if I missed anybody. First of all, my co-chairs, who are wonderful, and we got Webb Brightwell, who just started in the group, and Martha Davis, Amanda, I got you, Amanda, Kathy Harlan, Lori Hulak, who did I miss? Jennifer McAllister, Brenda Kavanaugh, Matthew Kirk, Julie Renkis, and Alice Ruther. So thank you guys. Oh, and Amanda, I missed Amanda Mesqua. Oh my God, she was very important because she did the draft of the form. So anyway, for those of you who have taken a look at it, do you have any comments or feedback on it? Okay, well, let me ask the room this. Do you think that this is a good way to go? Yes. Everyone's nodding. Any other comments other than that? So you're going to let me have my drink tonight? He says no. Okay, so it is still in draft form. It was sent on the listserv on Monday. If you didn't get it, let me know or ask those who are on that listserv to forward it to you. It's not finalized yet. Maybe there's some other things you want to add to the list of considerations, and that's all I have to say on that. Which leads us to the templates themselves.
Hooray! Template updates. So, as we know, we made a lot of changes to the templates over the last few years, which has been positive, but especially for institutions that have to pre-program their templates can be daunting, to say the least. So we are trying to stick to refraining from making any further changes to the templates as much as possible, especially as we continue to work through what language for the certificates of confidentiality would be best. And so we want to make sure that we're not updating in 2018 and then updating again in 2019. So that would be a lot of additional work. But there have been some little bugs and other instabilities in the code that we've gotten feedback on. So Laura Register, thank you so much, has been working diligently on doing some
just in case there's some feedback we missed.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, this issue. All right, fixed price subawards, prior approval, and clinical trials. So we've been talking about this for a while. Let me just give a little bit of a recap how this all stemmed into a working group, into several FDP sessions that we had on this topic. So remember, about a year and a half ago, this stemmed from the fact that NIH used to waive the prior approval requirement for any dollar amount for a fixed price subaward per an FAQ that they had pertaining to the uniform guidance. And then they took that away, as well as all the federal agencies, under the direction of OMB, that they had to request prior approval for any dollar amount of a fixed price subaward up to the simplified acquisition threshold. And we're going to get to the SAT in a minute. So as a result of that, and what happened was NIH revised their grants policy statement. It was the October 1st, 2016 version, which included the fact that we had to request prior approval. And actually, there wasn't a formal announcement about it. You had to look at the significant changes document in order to find that they had made that change. And so this was a big deal. Sam Ash from NIH was here, I guess it was over a year ago, where we started asking him questions about that. And indicating that this is going to be problematic for clinical trials. And what's funny is the issue wasn't really coming to bear until people really started to having to issue these things. And so I kind of knew that this was going to take a while to come full circle till we really started hearing feedback from the community experiencing this issue. And so let me tell you what happened. Jennifer McAllister from Duke University Medical Center, she started leading a working group where she's been collecting data from anyone who's able to provide it to her. So anytime that you request a fixed price subaward from a federal agency, and of course she's collecting mainly information from NIH, but any federal agency, what has been the response you have been given? Has it been consistent? And in particular, if you're issuing clinical trials, what's the response you have been given? Have there ever been exceptions made for going over the simplified acquisition threshold? So what came out of that working group is, one, the group also drafted some language, prior approval language, that you can use both at proposal time and at afterwards, after the award has been made, when you have to make a separate prior approval. And so let me go through here for a second. So through the working group, we've had some really lively discussions. So we had a session in January, and we had a session prior to that in September, where we just had these open, frank discussions. Well, what are clinical trial subsites exactly? Is everyone calling them subrecipients? Are some of you calling them vendors or contractors? What mechanisms are you using to collaborate with them? Are you using site agreements? That's a popular term I keep hearing. Are you using our NIH fixed price sample that we have online? Some folks are combining and mix-moshing cost reimbursable and fixed price. Are you just calling them per subject agreements? And so we also had the discussions related to requesting the prior approval and exceeding the SAT. And so, Jennifer, we played a little game of Kahoot last time for those of you who were able to fit in the room. We had about 80 people in the room. And so we were asking questions such as, are you issuing cost reimbursable agreements that only contain per patient payments? And about a quarter of the folks in the room said yes, and 75% no. And then another question we asked was, do you issue subawards that include both cost reimbursable and fixed per patient terms? 50-50, look at that. What does your institution consider a clinical site? Do you consider it a vendor, a subrecipient, or neither? And a good chunk said neither. That's the gray. A little bit said vendor. More than half said subrecipient. And has your institution adopted the FDP clinical trials sample that we have online? And more than half in the room said yes. but there's still a good chunk that said no, or maybe they're using their own long forms. But then maybe about a quarter of them said not yet, but you plan to. Speaking of which, let's talk about the simplified acquisition threshold for a moment. I think all of you are really paying attention to the micro purchase threshold, that $10,000. Well, guess what? The SAT went up too. So it was $150,000. And what happened was, as a result of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 18, the simplified acquisition threshold went from $150,000 to $250,000 per the letter that's dated, it was dated February 16th from the GSA Office of Government-Wide Policy. And so what it says in that letter, and here's the thing, everyone is still kind of debating and figuring out what the real effective date is of this change with the simplified acquisition threshold. In the letter it says the CAAC letter is effective immediately and remains in effect until the increased thresholds are incorporated into the FAR or is otherwise rescinded. And so folks are wondering, well, is it really the date of the letter because the memo, I guess, was written, it was directed to civilian agencies, or is it effective when it gets codified into the FAR? And so there's still question, and there really isn't a definitive answer to that yet, but I know that there's lots of discussions going on with auditors and with OMB on this very question. But of course, from a fixed price subaward perspective, this has an impact, the fact that it went from $150,000 to $250,000. At least it helps a little bit. So let's talk about what happened after, and I know I'm giving a lot of updates here, and I certainly want to hear your questions and your feedback, but I'm just bringing everyone up to speed. So after the meeting that we had at an FDP in January, that working session, we were trying to figure out our next steps. And so we've been partnering actually with COGR, with Pamela Webb here, who leads the Research Compliance and Administration Committee over at COGR, to start having conversations with NIH about this issue, in particular as it relates to clinical trials. And so during the last COGR meeting, Jennifer McAllister, who leads this working group, and myself, we sat with Pamela and that group and Sam Ash at NIH, and we presented to them a listing of the burdens and possible alternatives around this issue. And we asked them, can the NIH grants policy statement be amended to give a blank prior approval on awards that fund clinical trials? Possibly, we know that they intend to flag notices of awards in the future with a designator indicating that it is a clinical trial. Well, maybe they can also indicate that if there's subawards on it and it's fixed price, that we got the prior approval right there in the notice of award. We also recognize, though, that it doesn't negate obtaining prior approval for the usual things that you would need. So, for example, if we're working with a foreign subrecipient, obviously that's not going to be waived. We're going to have to still get prior approval. Can NIH grant prior approvals exceeding the simplified acquisition threshold? And what is your position on subrecipient versus contractor? Maybe there's a third category out there. They didn't answer that one yet. So, so we can't quite go there. But we're going to continue these discussions. So this is where we left off. We really dug and tried to see if they would be agreeable to amending the language that's in the grants policy statement. And guess what? Did you know in the DoD General Research Terms and Conditions, dated September 2017, they do carve it out. And they define clinical trial sites not as fixed award, but as fixed rate. And so they have language in that grants policy statement, in their terms and conditions, that carve it out and basically state that it's not subject to prior approval. So what we did was we took a little bit of this language, finagled it, and what we're in the process of doing right now is we're going to present to NIH and SAM this proposed language to incorporate into the grants policy statement. And I won't read all the details of this, but what the essential thing is that I'm highlighting here is since this type of site agreement is a fixed rate rather than a fixed amount subaward as defined by 45 CFR 75353 and blah, 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 NIH prior approval is not required to enter into this type of transaction, provided that there is no other factor, for example, foreign site or the site agreement constitute a change in scope, that would itself require NIH prior approval. Because these types of transactions are not based on a fixed amount, this type of agreement is also not subject to the simplified acquisition threshold cap. All right. So I don't know where it's going to go because we're literally, I mean, it's all drafted and it's ready to go. It's like, boom, ready to go. So now this is where the questions come in. Maybe it's what do I do now and what's going on, but let me hear some of your thoughts, questions, feedback on what's going on. I know I've heard a little bit prior. You had something? No. So, oh, yes.
I have a question about the 250K.
Yeah.
Is that only for federal contracts or is that assistance agreement as well?
It's any federal, right?
It's used for the contract except that when grants or any other part reference simplified acquisition threshold, that's the simplified acquisition threshold.
Okay.
So it wasn't designed for grants, but because now, like the insurance policy statement has that restriction, and the UG has a restriction for a fixed amount over the simplified acquisition threshold, it kind of pulls it into the grant book.
But there's still the conflicting terms between UG and that letter between 150K and 250K?
Well, the UG is says simplified acquisition threshold, we just.
Yeah, but it defines it within CFR 200.313, I think.
Yeah, I think it says, which is currently at 150.
150, well, that's what I'm wondering, is if those terms conflict, is it the lesser of the amount? Like, what's the audit
When
information
it
on that?
says when it's currently set at, that was at the moment of time, they wrote it that way on purpose, right? So that if it got adjusted upward later, they wouldn't have to change the wording, they wouldn't have to update the terms, they just said the real designator there is the simplified acquisition threshold. And for convenience, we're telling you that at the moment the UG was published, it happened to have been at 150.
Okay. Do they intend to update that information?
No, I don't think, probably not. I mean, we'll see it in agency guidance, but we won't, I don't think they will. So
Okay.
maybe they will the next time they touch it. But
So I'll just say two quick things, and I'll continue with the questions. Sam did seem in the room very receptive to this. Oh, really? You know, DoD has this language? Yeah, we'll review it. We're receptive to it. And then two, if you're currently having issues, so remember, Jennifer McAllister is still collecting information because some of the struggles that she was having with issuing these is that she was getting inconsistent information from the different NIH institutes. Some of them were telling her, well, once you exceed the threshold, you got to stop and now issue a cost reimbursement. And she was trying very hard to explain, well, that's not really possible, and you're going to disrupt science and patient enrollment. And so not only should she be collecting information on it, but she can provide you with who she's been talking to and where she kind of left off in these discussions and when she was able to kind of get this situation waived. And so if you let us know, let me and her know, then we'll try to help you through it or tell you who we've been talking to kind of get you through the process. So, yeah. Yeah, you.
Starting to talk when it was me. As a possible alternative, if NIH is not willing to actually change the language in the GPS, it sounds like there could be an FAQ that could clarify the meaning of fixed amount versus fixed rate.
What I guess the question then winds up, well, what's the weight of the FAQ for an audit? That's
Right.
the problem.
Right. I would say especially because this is presenting a new definition, that it really does have to be somewhere in the grants policy statement itself if you want it to hold up.
At least the good news is that they're aware of the issue. Yep.
So what is your advice for operating in the new one?
I don't know. It's I mean, I know, it's business as
Right.
usual, but if you're having issues, at least I would say come to me and Jennifer, because at least, like, we could tell you, if you're talking to the same people that she's been talking to, at least we could give you a heads up. Hey, you know, this is how this person responded, and this is how we might have resolved it. Yep.
So we had this issue come up because we're one of the oncology groups, and Sam was on the call last fall, and we had to return F&A because we weren't, they say that we overcharged with F&A because we were treating them as vendors, which had been the original intent of the program. And so we had to return F&A, and now we have to write subcontracts. And Sam was on the call for all of these clinical trial sites, and he wouldn't let us go over the simplified acquisition.
When was this?
Of 150. And they did come up with a workaround, which is so hokey, but basically people who go over the simplified acquisition of 150, we have to write multiple agreements with them based on different types of cancer research.
Oh.
So like,
They're trying to work with the two different scopes of work.
yes, one for breast, one for ovarian, and so our subcontract volume is
When was that call that you had with him?
in the fall.
Okay, so when we talked with him, this was much more recent. This was in February.
It means that people are complaining.
Yeah.
You get your grant management specialist and ask them to get Sam on the call too, because they need to know this.
Right. That's a good idea, actually. Like, if there's a way to get opera involved, if you're having these heavy discussions. Yep.
Yeah, I'll write it separately and share this, but we're having an issue right now that even the grants policy statement isn't helping us. We put in a request for a fixed price award. It's not a clinical trial. There's a complicated story behind it, but we felt offered a good justification for a fixed price award. We got a long response from the GMS trying to describe the differences between a subaward and a fee-for-service vendor contract, which was not what we were proposing. But she's equating a fixed price subaward to a fee-for-service agreement, telling us that there's a programmatic activity, which we never disputed, that we never said there wasn't, and therefore we needed to issue, it sounded like a traditional subaward to her, and she's not giving us approval. And we're in the middle of the dialogue right now, so we're going to go back to her and tactfully cite the grants policy statement that allows for a subaward based on this amount. But I don't want us to get too excited. I mean, it's in there in the grants policy statement now that that's allowable, and we're having this protracted dialogue trying to resolve the situation. And I'll send it to you and Jennifer.
Yeah. I think no matter what happens with the GPS, I think we want to continue to receive these types of issues that you're experiencing communicated to us so we could collect it, because I think we're going to continue this conversation with NIH to further define these things and have them better understand how it's not a fixed, what you're describing.
It's not a fee-for-service. We never
Fee for
argued that
service.
it was. It's not
Right.
a regular agreement, but they're just really pushing back and equating those two things, which
Yeah, go ahead.
we don't.
Well, I was just thinking that Sam also, when we met with him, he also told us that once this is settled and to the extent there's change made, they intend to train all the ICs. And I think we all were, yes. that would be fantastic if that could happen, so.
Yeah.
Curious. So the OMB has allowed us to extend or get an exception on the procurement section of UG. So I'm just curious, why is this already an issue? Why can't we just make an argument that, hey, we're exempt from the procurement section and therefore this doesn't apply yet, at least until when the end of the procurement is I mean, the whole procurement section of the UG, actually, we've been exempted from that. And we've been able to, in our procurement policies, write that we've elected to delay the implementation of the procurement section. So why are the other APAs pushed to comply with the $150,000 or $250,000?
Oh, okay. So this isn't really, when it comes to this piece of it, of the threshold, of the simplified acquisition threshold, this really doesn't have to do with the procurement section of uniform guidance that you're talking about. This is under the post-award section 200.331 and 332 section of the uniform guidance, which is the requirements of pass-through entities that have to issue subawards to subrecipients. And if we choose to use fixed price, it states in there that we have to get prior approval and we cannot exceed the simplified acquisition threshold. So they're just using the simplified acquisition threshold as a threshold, but it's not tied to the procurement piece. Any other comments or questions? We're headed in the right direction. Oh, yep. Brenda, yeah.
So I will add this to make everybody a little more upset. When we worked on the fixed price clinical trial stakeholders out there, NCAS, that funds the CPSI, paid for that. It was done through Vanderbilt University. They paid for the conference calls. It was a joint effort between FCP and NCAS. NCAS was ecstatic when this was done. They were so excited. So I contacted them when all this happened, and I said, oh, just so you know, essentially we're being told we can't use this sample template because nobody's giving us the prior approval we need, or they're telling us we have to treat these sites as fee-for-service or vendors. Unfortunately, the NCAS guy came back to me and said, oh, I'm going to defer to the policy office. And so we're right there.
Okay.
And I thought the CTSIs would really want to jump on this because they're the ones that wanted this sample. But
Right. Yeah. But I also think it's interesting that we have different language in DOD than what we have in NIH, and we're trying to promote consistency here. So there you go. What? Yeah.
So do we have any ability to make suggestions for that federal summit that they're planning for this summer and things they might want to talk about like this?
Anyone got an in on the federal summit?
That summit really isn't for this kind of purpose. It's more about the grander overall goals and objectives of the FDP and how to get more federal engagement. So I think starting to beat up on them about this would be the worst way to try to get more federal engagement. Maybe we'll leave it for a different time. I'll, as long as I'm talking,
Yeah.
I'll add that Koger Costing has seen the 2018 compliance supplement draft, and so it's trying to address that part about the micro purchase threshold and simplified acquisition threshold not being codified in the FAR. But it's really all in terms of the purchasing. It has nothing to do with this. It's just telling the auditors, until that's codified, still don't write them up for using the higher thresholds. They can use them even though it's not technically correct, because it's not codified.
So my question would be, can people ask up to the 250 now, today, in their proposals and even after award? Would that ever be an issue later on if we were audited? No? No idea. So that's one of the things we have to clarify with them. And we'll ask that question when we submit our draft language.
There's one more comment.
One more question. Yeah.
What about also in the meantime, until we get further with the NIH, maybe using some of this language, because I'm going back to it because it's really great, it's a great line, and integrating it into the guidance language for asking for prior approval, so that we start putting it in front of them every time we ask for it.
What do you think of that? Oh, so let me repeat the question. So as a suggestion and what to do in the interim before, while we're waiting for NIH to respond to our draft language, when we make the prior approval requests, should we include some of this draft language in there so NIH gets used to seeing it? Any thoughts on that from the Koger friends? No?
And maybe
Or